These are the most interesting historical photos and unusual objects from the past. Let's get 100,000 subscribers. In March 1946, more than 7,000 retired military planes stood side by side in the Arizona desert after World War II. Their metal skins were later cut up and reborn as cars, home appliances, and other peacetime goods. In 1990, engineers at a NASA lab in California tested this bulky virtual reality station to study airflow around aircraft. The heavy headset and wired glove let the user grab and move three-dimensional models in space. In 1946, many children in Tokyo were left without family or support after the war and lived on the streets. To survive, they searched trash bins for leftovers from nearby food stalls and offices. This is the real Alcatraz cell where Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers slowly cut a tunnel behind the sink using spoons and homemade tools. They left soap and papier-mâché heads on the pillows and escaped on 11 June 1962. In 1916, doctors recorded an early electrocardiogram with the patient sitting still, arms and leg dipped in buckets of salty water as electrodes. The huge machine on the right turned his heart signals into a thin ink line on moving paper. In the 1920s and 1930s, Paris sewer hunter Josephine Dupont, called the Rat Queen, caught up to 500 rats a night with only a stick and her bare hands. In 1950, researchers placed electrodes on Albert Einstein's head to record one of the most famous brains with an early electroencephalogram test. They hoped his brain waves would reveal hidden patterns behind his ability to imagine space, time, and light in new ways. On 2 May 1946, prisoners at Alcatraz seized weapons and hostages, starting the prison's most famous uprising, later called the Battle of Alcatraz. One guard secretly used a confiscated camera to capture this rare view from behind the bars, while Marines spent 3 days fighting to retake the island. In 1979, Los Angeles was so polluted that some drivers wore heavy masks like this just to move through the thick brown smog. After years of pressure, the city forced factories and cars to use cleaner technology, and the air slowly became much clearer. In 1928, high-wire star Carl the Bird Wallenda fell from a 12-meter cable in the Barnum Circus when the wire suddenly snapped before 3,000 silent spectators. He survived with many broken bones. In 1914, this horse-drawn ambulance in Kiev rushed patients through the snow long before siren cars existed. A single call with the medical team cost between 3 and 5 rubles, a serious sum for most city workers of that time. During 1944 and 1945, some Japanese military units used this brutal underwater barrel method on captured spies, even filming it as a warning. Only a few of those secret images survived. A line of Syrian trucks and guns lies frozen on a desert road after an Israeli airstrike during the 1973 war. Such attacks on supply convoys helped rapidly weaken frontline forces and shift the course of the short conflict. On a night in 1959, 27 patients at Willowbrook Hospital slipped out through the windows while guard Thomas Gray stood below taking pictures instead of raising the alarm. He was fired the next day, and 11 of those figures climbing into the dark were never seen again. In 1987, workers in the Turkmen Soviet Republic climbed these man-made mountains of cotton, spreading the fluffy fiber into huge storage piles. Cotton was called white gold here, and entire regions were pushed to meet harvest quotas. On 11 June 1955, a Mercedes race car at Le Mans lost control at about 240 kilometers per hour and struck the barrier in front of packed stands. In just a few seconds, debris swept through the crowd, causing one of motor racing's worst recorded disasters. On a 4 October 1993, these Russian police from the Guard of the Supreme Council sat under military watch after being detained in Moscow. The scene came just hours after armed clashes around the Parliament building during the country's deep political crisis. On 5 April 1902, a wooden grandstand at a Glasgow horse race collapsed from about 4 meters high, sending part of the crowd crashing to the track. 26 people lost their lives and more than 500 were hurt. In 1989, prisoners from a strict regime colony near the town of Zima in Irkutsk region were transported to an industrial work site in these open-cage trucks. On 20 March 1947, a mine in West Virginia collapsed 300 meters underground, trapping 31 miners, including Robert Collins, who worked with a camera mounted on his helmet. After 4 days of digging, rescuers found his camera in the rubble. In February 1976, a reporter in Angola recorded this interview with a 14-year-old boy in uniform, holding a full-sized rifle almost as tall as he was. The image quietly shows how teenagers were pulled into the long civil conflict and treated as regular fighters. On 12 March 1928, the St. Francis Dam in California failed, and a huge flood up to 43 meters high raced through 7 towns in about 5 hours, taking more than 430 lives. On 12 October 1931, crowds filled the mountain as the Christ the Redeemer statue in Rio de Janeiro was officially unveiled and lit for the first time. Pilots in biplanes flew past the outstretched arms in a daring salute, turning the ceremony into a sky show above the city. On 30 July 1916, the Black Tom Pier in New Jersey erupted when about 900 tons of dynamite detonated, a blast heard up to 150 kilometers away that shattered windows across Manhattan. In April 1912, a crowd in New York packed this street corner, staring at a bulletin board as fresh lists of Titanic survivors were posted line by line. Each new name meant one family could breathe again, while others waited in silence, hoping to see someone they loved appear. In 1919, engineers tested a new tracked armored vehicle in the Alps, hiding it under a shell that made it look like a tourist bus. The crowd watched it crawl up steep slopes, while officers quietly measured how well this bus could climb in future mountain operations. On 7 May 1915, the liner Lusitania was hit by a German submarine torpedo and sank in just 18 minutes as passengers leapt from high decks into icy Atlantic water. Survivor Charles Fratman had a small camera in his pocket and caught this blurred image from a lifeboat. On 12 April 1961, the Vostok 1 rocket stood on the Baikonur pad as engineers made final checks for the first human trip into space with Yuri Gagarin inside. In a few hours, this booster would lift him into orbit. On 18 March 1937, a gas blowout at this Texas drilling rig turned into a 50-meter fireball that lit up the evening sky. Driller Jim Hopkins photographed it from a nearby tower, the heat scorching him as 11 crew members failed to escape. On 30 January 1943, the remnants of the German 6th Army under Field Marshal Paulus shuffled through the snow at Stalingrad to lay down their arms. This long column of exhausted men marked the end of one of the war's fiercest sieges. On 27 January 1941, a tunnel in Mine No. 5 in Pennsylvania collapsed 200 meters underground, trapping 63 miners in seconds. Helmet-mounted gear worn by photographer Jack Malloy captured this flash of rock. In 1972, this stretch of the Vietnam-Cambodia border was lined with deep trenches filled with sharpened bamboo stakes, some reportedly coated with toxins. The spikes turned the quiet jungle strip into a hidden barrier meant to stop patrols long before they reached the wire and guards above. On a 6 April 1936, an F5 tornado near Gainesville lifted the Miller family home off its foundation and threw it about 50 meters across the field. Storm chaser Jack Hale took this picture from his car. In 1945, a column of Soviet T-34-85 tanks paused in a German forest just before the final push toward Berlin. These medium tanks, built in the tens of thousands, had become the main steel spearhead of the Red Army's advance into the heart of the Third Reich. On 5 August 1971, an accomplice flew a helicopter over San Quentin's yard and dropped a rope ladder as 3 inmates scrambled up while guards fired. 2 climbers were hit and fell. 1 made it aboard but was caught 6 days later. In 1958, this city bench in South Africa carried a sign reading "Europeans Only," a quiet symbol of daily separation under apartheid law. The children sit and smile on it, while the plank above their heads shows how the state tried to divide who was allowed to rest in a public place. On 31 May 1889, the Johnstown Dam failed, and about 20 million tons of water, 12 meters high, raced into the valley at roughly 64 kilometers per hour. The flood swept whole houses from their foundations, took more than 2,200 lives in minutes. In January 1924, Vladimir Lenin was already severely weakened by a series of strokes and could barely move without help. This rare photo from Gorky shows him wrapped in furs in a wheelchair, leading the new Soviet state only on paper, while other leaders quietly prepared to take his place. These shame masks were medieval punishment devices, strapped onto people and chained to public posts, so every spike and animal snout turned them into a walking warning. Centuries later, this set was found bricked up in the attic of an old English jail. In 1933, this New York stand from St. Andrew's 1-cent coffee society served hot coffee for a penny to people hit hard by the Great Depression. Simple kiosks like this kept thousands warm on winter mornings and quietly doubled as informal job and news hubs on the street. In the 1920s, this fairground performer called Needleman stood on stage with dozens of pins and needles stuck into his skin, while crowds gasped and cheered. After repeated shows left him with serious infections and permanent scars. In the 1920s, soldiers of the new Soviet government carried icons in gilded frames out of churches as state property. Many of these seized treasures were melted for precious metal or sent to museums, part of a drive to weaken the old religious power. In the early 1900s, this experimental electric collar was put on factory workers who broke rules, giving them a brief daily jolt that owners claimed would improve discipline and energy. After a public scandal, the device was removed from use. In 1945, captured soldiers in Antwerp were briefly held in an empty zoo cage, lying on straw where animals had once been kept. The image became a stark symbol of how quickly war can turn cities, and even places of leisure, into improvised prison camps. Grady Stiles, known as Lobster Boy, was born with a rare condition that fused his fingers and toes into claw-like shapes. Circus owners turned his body into a sideshow attraction for decades, and he spent most of his life earning a living on stage rather than in a normal job or home. In 1946, this London shop window, filled with steel prosthetic legs, arms, and boots, showed what many returning veterans now needed just to walk down the street. Artificial limbs became one of the most in-demand, everyday products of the post-war years. These punishment boots from the late 19th century hid sharp metal spikes inside, locked onto the feet of vagrants as a harsh way to keep them still. After an inquiry exposed their use in one city shelter, the director was removed and the boots were stored as evidence of that era's cruelty. Before opening in 1976, engineers packed the new Moscow Bridge in Kiev with rows of heavy dump trucks to simulate maximum rush hour traffic. Sensors measured how the steel deck sagged by just a few centimeters, proving the cable-stayed giant was safe to carry the city for decades. This rare photo shows a Mongolian healer in the 1930s whose skin was marked by ichthyosis, creating a pattern like carved tree bark. Villagers saw her as a person of special power and quietly brought gifts, hoping her touch and words would keep their families healthy. Sailors of submarine Sheech 215 carefully load a fresh torpedo at the Black Sea Fleet Base in Poti, Georgia, in 1943. Each silver cylinder like this could travel underwater for several kilometers, turning a quiet patrol boat into one of the most feared hunters of the war. At this late 1920s card table, every player is a veteran using a polished metal arm shaped for shuffling and dealing. They called themselves the One-Armed Aces, turning a weekly poker night into a quiet show of skill, balance, and new strength. In the 1980s, this Soviet lab wired Alan Chumak to monitors, measuring pulse and brain waves while he performed his famous energy session on a volunteer. Scientists hoped to catch on tape the moment belief and biology met. Londoners in the early 1900s whispered about a quiet Scandinavian cellar nicknamed Thor Jotun, said to stand 246 centimeters tall. Crowds came to this market not just for cabbage, but to confirm the gentle giant was real. James Earl Ray, in a protective vest and handcuffs, is escorted by officers in 1968 after being captured as the main suspect in the case of Martin Luther King Jr. He kept changing his story for years, feeding endless debate. In Paris in 1912, dealers quietly bought long hair from the poorest people and resold it for luxury wigs and theater costumes. This rare hidden photo, later filed in a police archive, shows just how big that strange shadow business once was. In 1957, America's first attempt to send a satellite into orbit ended seconds after liftoff, when the Vanguard rocket rose a meter, lost thrust, and fell back into a fireball on the pad. The disaster was broadcast across the country, pushing engineers into a crash program that led to the successful Explorer missions only months later. This rusted horse-drawn cage was a mobile cell said to be used in Russia around 1917 to move and isolate suspected revolutionaries right in the street. Packed with iron bars on all sides, it turned an ordinary city road into a rolling prison. A British Harrier pilot, lost without radio or navigation, used the jet's vertical landing ability to set down on a tiny Spanish cargo ship near the Canary Islands in 1983, crushing this parked van in the process. This eerie portrait shows the fairground figure known only as Mr. Lazarus in France in 1888, who toured markets with his bandaged face and patterned skin. He turned his strange illness into a living story, asking stunned visitors to give coins for hospitals. A wartime crowd in occupied Zhytomyr watches as sculptor Moishe Kogan and former People's Judge Wolf Kuiper stand on a truck platform, displayed as enemies by the new authorities. Just a few decades earlier, they were respected figures of culture and law. A rare look inside an early 20th century intake hall shows new prisoners lined up in silence while guards watch from the shadows. The blurred keys in the foreground remind us that one unseen hand decided who stayed locked in and who walked back out. One of history's strangest contrasts is that the regime's main propagandist was expelled from his church for a marriage rule, while its future dictator was never formally removed from the rolls. In 1989, only a day after the Berlin Wall officially opened, families were already squeezing through rough holes in the concrete right beside the Reichstag, turning a once deadly border into a casual walkway. East German guards, who had enforced the divide for decades now, simply watched as children were passed through the breach. In 1940, these three young men from South Carolina were photographed just after being taken into custody for a violent late-night attack on a couple walking home from a party. They were accused of beating the woman's companion unconscious. In January 2014, 15-year-old Aitzaz Hassan stood outside his school in Hangu, Pakistan, and confronted a stranger wearing an explosive vest, refusing to let him reach the crowded morning assembly. Aitzaz lost his life when the device went off, but his decision stopped the attacker at the gate. In 19th century Paris, the village of Robinson lured city dwellers into oak tree taverns where roast chicken and wine were hoisted up in baskets by rope pulleys. Families climbed winding stairs to dine in wooden cabins among the branches, turning a simple meal into a tiny escape high above the streets. In 1910, brothers Lewis and Temple Abernathy rode on their own from Oklahoma to New York, becoming famous long before they were even teenagers. For the return trip, they calmly upgraded from saddles to engine, buying a car. As a kid in 1970s Honolulu, Barry Obama and his friends staged a no-homework strike with handmade signs and serious faces. Nobody knew this barefoot boy protester would one day walk into the White House instead of the principal's office. This early 1900s portrait shows a man who survived smallpox, his face permanently marked long after the fever was gone. Before modern vaccines, even those who lived through such outbreaks often carried these visible reminders for the rest of their lives. In 1917, the four daughters of Tsar Nicholas II shaved their heads together after measles made their hair fall out in handfuls. Court photographers quietly captured this rare moment where Russia's most famous princesses suddenly looked more like mischievous schoolgirls than royal figures. A lone house stands in front of a New Bedford textile mill, blazing with light as it runs through the night in January 1941. The glowing windows hint at thousands of looms working non-stop, part of the rush to supply fabric for a world already at war. Park Ranger Roy Sullivan calmly poses with his hat, burned straight through by one of the 7 lightning strikes he survived over 35 years. Known as the human lightning rod, he holds the world record for most documented strikes on a single person and kept returning to work in the storms anyway. Cave diver Dave Shaw smiles in his gear just before a record-breaking descent into South Africa's Bushman's Hole. On this final dive, he reached about 872 feet while trying to recover another diver's remains, blacked out in the extreme depth. In 1911, 4-year-old Mary stands on a crate in a Louisiana cannery, already shucking 2 tubs of oysters a day beside her mother, the fastest worker in the room. Photos like this shocked the public and helped push the United States towards stricter child labor laws. In 1961, Judy Garland sits backstage in Las Vegas, wrapped in a towel, eyes lifted to the lights, as if she is begging the room for just one more burst of strength. Behind the glamour of The Wizard of Oz, her Vegas shows were grueling marathons. John F. Kennedy chats casually with a neighbor while wearing the custom back brace he relied on every day for severe spine problems. The corset-style support, first made for him after his wartime injuries, was so constant a companion that he was even wearing it during his final motorcade in 1963. Cool jazz star Chet Baker looks like 2 different people here. A smooth 26-year-old prodigy on the left and a 56-year-old face deeply carved by decades of addiction and life on the road on the right. Just 2 years after that second photo in Amsterdam, he fell from a hotel window and lost his life. Investigators stand over the narrow underground chamber where 20-year-old Barbara Mackle was held during a kidnapping in 1968. She spent more than 3 days in this ventilated box before rescuers found her and brought her out alive. At 15, French boxer Fred Bretonel still had a smooth, boyish face. By 23, years in the ring had carved it into the mask of a seasoned fighter. Over 76 professional bouts, he logged 42 wins, 14 draws, and 18 losses, with 14 victories coming by knockout. In April 1848, photographer William Edward Kilburn pointed his experimental camera at Kennington Common and froze a sea of hats and banners into one of the first photos of a mass political rally. In 1847, a French daguerreotype photographer pointed his bulky camera at a street scene and accidentally made history by freezing the moment a young man was being taken into custody. This blurry image is now considered the first true news photograph, the starting point of everything from war reporting to today's breaking news shots. Young Japanese pilots in 1945 tie each other's headbands before flying one-way missions in the last months of the Pacific War. Many of them were barely out of school, and some wrote farewell letters saying they hoped their sacrifice would shorten the conflict for families back home. Dressed in her Sunday best, this young migrant woman leans from a wooden porch in July 1940, moments before leaving the rural South behind. She is part of the Great Migration, when millions of African Americans traveled north, chasing factory jobs, better pay. Freshly liberated political deportees, some still in striped camp coats and leaning on crutches, marched down the Champs-Élysées in 1945 after a ceremony at the tomb of the unknown soldier. For the first time in years, they moved through Paris as free citizens, turning survival into a quiet victory parade. A tired German officer sits on splintered beams in ruined Saarbrücken, quietly eating canned rations handed out by American troops in March 1945. For many soldiers in the collapsing Reich, former enemies became the only source of food and safety as the war turned against them. A Japanese-American woman laughs as a military officer checks her suitcase at the Santa Anita camp in California in April 1942. Scenes like this hit a hard truth. Families were being forced from their homes under wartime orders and sent to guarded camps for an unknown future. German troops carry out a harsh reprisal raid in Bosnia in the 1940s, torching village homes suspected of sheltering partisan fighters. For many mountain communities, scenes like this meant losing everything in a single afternoon as their entire world went up in smoke. A long column of horse-drawn carts creaks out of Kiev in February 1918, carrying seized goods as Bolshevik forces withdraw from the briefly occupied city. For residents watching from the roadside, each wagon rolling past meant another piece of their hometown vanishing down the frozen road. Egyptian river hunters pose on the Nile shore around 1905, using a taxidermied crocodile to demonstrate how they'd snare and pin the real thing. The staged scene was meant for tourists and photographers, turning dangerous rivercraft into a carefully choreographed show. In 1946, a young Marilyn Monroe posed as a pin-up model for artists, earning $10 an hour so they could turn her photos into painted posters. This cheerful studio shot shows her helping the painter match every detail, long before she became a Hollywood legend. In 1941, children in the short-lived Republic of Uzbekistan lie on a bare classroom floor, carefully practicing calligraphy with inkwells and simple pens. Even as their region changed by the week, lessons in writing carried on, preserving language and culture line by line. Fritz Dietrich stands on the gallows yard of Landsberg Prison in 1948, moments before his execution for ordering the killing of 7 captured American airmen. Only later did investigators uncover his much larger role in the mass shootings of civilians in and around Liepāja, Latvia during the war. Black South Africans pull a wagon of loved ones lost in the 1922 Rand Revolt, escorted by mounted police through the tense streets of Johannesburg. The uprising began as a white miners' strike, but spiraled into armed clashes involving radical groups. Women supporters of the Rand Revolt March in Johannesburg in 1922, carrying a banner that calls for workers to unite while openly demanding rights only for white South Africans. This strange mix of class politics and racial exclusion showed how early movements there could speak about equality, yet still defend a divided society. Massive machines pour fresh concrete as one of the first stretches of the new interstate highway system takes shape in 1956, turning empty fields into a straight ribbon of road, built for fast coast-to-coast travel and national defense. 2 Cuban Liberation Army scouts crouch in the brush near Santiago de Cuba, aiming a Remington and a Mauser that came from opposite sides of the conflict. Many Cuban fighters used whatever weapons they could capture or buy secondhand. Overnight in August 1961, Berliners woke to find barbed wire cutting straight through their streets and families. These 2 mothers, suddenly living on opposite sides, stretched their arms over the new barrier just to let their children touch for a moment. Chicago officer Richard Nuccio shakes hands while fellow policemen hand him a $1,300 check for his legal defense, years after he fatally shot a teenager on duty. Despite this show of support, he had just been found guilty in court, and no knife was ever recovered to match his story. Canadian riflemen of the 48th Highlanders sprint for cover across a mud-soaked farmyard during a German counterattack north of San Leonardo, Italy, on December 10, 1943. This moment came in the harsh winter fighting of the Ortona campaign, where every ruined house and bare tree became improvised protection. Hollywood star Jane Mansfield stands proudly beside her mother, Vera Jeffrey Palmer, the woman who first pushed her toward acting and language lessons long before the cameras arrived. By the late 1950s, Jane was one of Hollywood's most photographed women. Hollywood leading man Cesar Romero swapped movie sets for a Coast Guard assault transport in 1942, serving aboard USS Cavalier in the Pacific. Despite his fame, he insisted on regular duty, taking part in dangerous beach landings alongside the rest of the crew. American soldiers grip a guide rope as they pack into a rubber boat to cross Italy's Volturno River in October 1943. This risky night crossing helped push Allied lines north toward Rome through flooded banks and stubborn defenses. Under the harsh spotlights of the new Berlin border, East Germans sprinted through fresh coils of barbed wire before the concrete wall even existed. One of them was guard Konrad Schumann, who famously leapt the fence in full uniform on August 15, 1961. Robert Earl Hughes was one of the heaviest recorded people in medical history, reaching about 486 kilograms at a height of 184 centimeters by 1958. His weight grew at a stunning rate from childhood, jumping from 92 kilos at age 6 to over 430 kilos by his late 20s. A Russian farm worker and his family crowd around a crackling radio, hearing distant voices and music carried to their village for the very first time. For many rural families in the early 1930s, sets like this turned evenings in the field into moments where they could suddenly follow sports, news. 12-year-old Hussein Abdul Rasul, a water boy on Howard Carter's team, was the one who spotted the first carved step that led to the sealed entrance of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922. After Howard Carter's team cleared the shaft in 1922, the entrance to Tutankhamun's tomb looked like this narrow stone throat leading straight into the Valley of the King's most guarded secret. Every treasure had to be lifted out by hand, so archaeologists in shirts and vests carefully carried gilded pieces up the steep steps, like firefighters passing buckets. Otto Richter, a German Jewish refugee, stands with his wife outside Ellis Island in 1936, begging Americans to sign petitions so he will not be sent back to Nazi Germany. Their desperate homemade signs turned a quiet immigration case into a public test of how far the United States. In 1912, this stretch of California's Highway 101 toward Santa Barbara was a narrow wooden causeway perched right above the Pacific, where early motorists rumbled along on planks instead of pavement. It was one of the first coastal, scenic highways. Men in cheap London lodging houses could pay a penny to sleep sitting up, leaning over a tight rope instead of renting a full bed for the night. This harsh penny hang kept you from collapsing to the floor. But despite the legend, it is not actually where the word hangover comes from. Chained to heavy iron balls, these D.C. prisoners were marched out to sweep Pennsylvania Avenue in 1909 instead of sitting in a cell. Chain gang street cleaning was meant as both free labor and public shame, turning everyday city chores into a moving display of punishment. Polish children turned the bombed-out shells of Warsaw's houses into an improvised playground in 1940 under German occupation. For many of them, climbing over rubble and shattered walls was the only version of normal childhood streets they ever knew. Late Qing Dynasty Court in a yamen, where bound suspects kneel low on rough planks while robed officials sit above them, one clerk in dark glasses recording every word. In Imperial China, just appearing before these local magistrates was considered a punishment in itself. Spectators in bleachers watch a 1957 atomic bomb test at the Nevada test site as the mushroom cloud blooms just miles away in the desert. For years, these tests were advertised as safe demonstrations of progress, and tourists even booked blast vacations to see the fireball with their own eyes. Once Emperor of China, Puyi now sits cross-legged in a Fuxian re-education center, quietly mending his worn jacket by hand. The man who once wore dragon robes and ruled millions became a model ordinary worker, used by the new government as a living lesson on how empires end. A mass of captured Boxer rebels sits on the dusty ground, their queues and shaved foreheads marking them as warriors of the failed 1900 uprising in northern China. For foreign troops, this scene was proof of victory. A young Japanese pilot tightens his rising sun headband, his vest packed with gear for a one-way mission in 1945. In the stillness before takeoff, these kamikaze squadrons were taught to see their final flight as the highest form of loyalty, even as the war around them was already slipping away. A color photo from the Nuremberg rallies shows Adolf Hitler moving through a sea of salutes, the stadium packed with carefully choreographed supporters. These grand spectacles were designed to project unity and power, even as the regime tightened its grip through fear, propaganda. Two siblings from an impoverished family share a single bowl of porridge, the older girl steadying it so her little brother can eat first. In a life where food was never guaranteed, this quiet moment shows how care and sacrifice often mattered more than anything on the table. Soviet soldiers pose with a British 40mm Vickers Mark II gun, adopted by the Red Army when Moscow quietly bought foreign weapons to modernize its artillery in the 1920s, firing 0.9 kilogram shells at about 585 meters per second and up to 90 rounds a minute. In 1966, a Thai airport used a trained elephant as a living tug to tow a sleek Caravel jetliner along the runway. It was cheaper than fuel-hungry tractors and became a surreal symbol of old Asia, literally pulling the jet age forward. Inside the French heavy tank Saint-Chamond, crewmen worked shoulder to shoulder in a cramped steel cave, surrounded by levers, shell racks, and a 75mm gun that shook the whole hull with every shot. This early giant looked powerful, but its long, overhanging nose made it notorious for getting stuck in trenches. These Vietnamese students study with bare feet above a hidden trench, ready to drop under their desks the moment the sirens warn of an air raid. For a whole generation, math lessons and grammar drills were learned side by side with escape drills. In Pleiku, South Vietnam, on 26 May 1967, a worn-out American soldier bows his head while a comrade holds his shoulder and grips his rifle. The scene strips away slogans and shows two young men who mostly dream of staying alive and one day going home. In 1917, Susan Lang was known across the United States as the most skilled woman motorcycle mechanic, proudly working on her Harley-Davidson like any seasoned shop pro, at a time when many women were told engines were not for them. In 1908, drivers lined up in New York City for the legendary New York to Paris auto race, planning to cross snow, mud, and even Siberia in fragile open cars like the one proudly advertising Michelin tires. Reporters swarmed the starting line, knowing they were watching the beginning of one of the wildest long-distance races in motoring history. On 5 September 1920, Polish leader Józef Piłsudski and Ukrainian commander Simon Petlura stood side by side with their officers in Stanisławów, celebrating a rare alliance against the advancing Red Army. Around 1900 in Western Australia, an Aboriginal boy is made to pull a white child in a toy cart, like a living prop in a studio portrait. Images like this quietly record how many Indigenous children were taken into homes as unpaid servants. Monte Cassino, one of Europe's oldest monasteries, stands here as a shattered shell after heavy Allied bombing in early 1944. The ruins show how a single strategic hilltop turned into a place where 14 centuries of history were almost erased in a few days of war. In 1989, Ronald and Doreen Jack left Prince George, British Columbia, with their two young sons after a stranger offered Ronald a well-paid logging job and even promised a place to stay, after one last phone call saying they had arrived safely. On March 28, 1979, a stuck valve and human errors caused Unit 2 at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania to partially melt down, releasing small amounts of radioactive gas. It became the most serious commercial nuclear accident in United States history and forced the entire industry to overhaul safety and training standards. On April 24, 1916, Ernest Shackleton and 5 men pushed the tiny lifeboat James Caird off Elephant Island, beginning an 800-mile gamble across the Southern Ocean to South Georgia, against hurricane winds, 30-foot waves, and freezing spray. Bare-chested boys in post-war St. Mary Cray turn a scrubby waste ground into their own boxing ring, cheered on by friends sitting on old scrap. For many Romani and Irish traveler kids in 1950s, Britain, worn gloves and open fields were the only sports club they could afford. Helen Wills Moody glides across the Wimbledon grass in 1938, winning yet another title in her legendary rivalry with Helen Jacobs. By the end of her career, Wills Moody had claimed 8 Wimbledon singles crowns, a record that stood untouched for decades. Around 1900, Maori women of Parihaka sit outside a rough timber cooking house, one calmly scraping potatoes with a shell. The white feathers in their hair were the quiet but powerful symbol of Parihaka's peaceful resistance to government seizure of their land. In 1918, an infantry patrol creeps up a steep wooded slope on the Salonika front, where Allied troops faced not only enemy fire, but malaria, heat, and brutal terrain. This forgotten Balkan front tied down hundreds of thousands of soldiers and quietly helped break the back of the Central Powers from the south. In September 1938, ethnic Germans in the Sudetenland pulled down a Czechoslovak border post, celebrating the looming handover of the region to Germany after months of tension and propaganda. This staged act at the frontier signaled how fast maps, loyalties, and entire lives were about to be redrawn in Central Europe. During the 1980 military takeover in Turkey, rows of civilians sit on a curb with heads down as soldiers stand guard behind them, a snapshot of the mass detentions that swept the country in a single night. This moment froze the instant when everyday people realized politics had suddenly turned their city into a barracks. A US AAFB-17 Blue Streak spirals away, trailing smoke after flak tore through its engines over Mersburg, Germany in November 1942. In those few seconds, the crew had to choose between staying with the crippled bomber or trusting their parachutes high above enemy territory. A United States officer kneels beside a Maori woman as they share steaming hangi, food slow-cooked in an earth oven, in New Zealand on 3 March 1943. Moments like this showed how wartime brought distant cultures face to face, not just on battlefields, but over simple meals. A young school teacher in Civil War-era Michigan sits stiffly for the camera, her heavy dress and calm stare matching the seriousness of a country at war. Born in upstate New York in 1837, she would go on to raise 7 children who all grew up to build solid, successful lives of their own. In the 1940s, when most gyms still treated combat sports as men only, this woman casually flips her partner with a clean judo throw while friends watch in awe. Judo was just starting to spread from Japan to American clubs and community centers. Wrapped in snow-white camouflage in 1940, Finnish marksman Simo Haiha waits in temperatures that dropped below -40 during the Winter War. Using only iron sights on his rifle, he became one of the most effective snipers in history, earning the chilling nickname White Death from the opposing side. A young German paratrooper, still wearing his badges, hides his face from the camera after being captured by the United States 1st Infantry Division in Belgium in January 1945. Just months before the war in Europe would end, many soldiers like him were realizing that the system they fought for was collapsing in front of the whole world. After the war, an American company turned pieces of stone from the ruined fireplace in Hitler's mountain home into souvenir ashtrays with the phrase, "Flick your ashes on Hitler's hearth," sold to returning Allied veterans starting in 1946. On this day in 1923, a small extremist party tried to turn this crowded Munich square into the starting point of a march on Berlin. But local police blocked the putsch within hours. Its leader landed in prison afterward, using the trial and his jail time to turn a short-lived street revolt into a national platform for his ideas. At the London Olympics in 1908, Ireland and Germany faced off in bicycle polo, steering one-handed while swinging mallets on a full-sized field. This odd mix of cycling and polo was only a demonstration event, but it drew big crowds and showed how experimental early Olympic sports could be. September 12, 1974, Boston launched court-ordered desegregation busing after Judge W. Arthur Garrity's Morgan v. Hennigan ruling. At South Boston High, jeering crowds threw rocks at arriving buses, and a geography class had only one student that day. November 20, 1934, Tennessee National Guard stopped an attempted lynching in Shelbyville after a crowd tried to seize a 17-year-old suspect. Troops intervened when tear gas failed, 4 rioters died, and the Bedford County Courthouse was later set on fire. By 1936, the Hitler Youth had become the only legal youth organization in Nazi Germany under the law on the Hitler Youth, claiming authority over all German youth and their training. Membership was effectively mandatory and surged into the millions with boys prominently staged at mass rallies like Nuremberg to display Nazi discipline and indoctrination. In 1908, 13-year-old Navajo orphan Dan Tsose killed 4 members of his community in New Mexico, saying they had treated him like a slave. He was sent to Leavenworth and received 4 concurrent 10-year manslaughter sentences. Records indicate he was paroled in 1916. Circa 1965 at Zivnov, Poland's 1st Assault Battalion, JW 4101, trained for behind-the-lines missions and often drilled in U.S.-style U.S. uniforms and Western kit. Formed from a reconnaissance unit and moved to Zunov in 1964, the battalion later became the core of Poland's modern Special Forces lineage. On the night of March 16, 1945, RAF bombers created a firestorm over Würzburg that destroyed about 90% of the city center in under 20 minutes and killed roughly 5,000 people. This aerial view from autumn 1945 shows the leveled Altstadt before large-scale post-war reconstruction began. In 1942, 2 of 8 Nazi saboteurs in Operation Pastorius defected to the FBI, exposing the plot. A military commission convicted all 8. 6 were executed on August 8, 1942, while the 2 informants had sentences commuted and were later deported. May 21, 1941, a high-altitude RAF photo confirmed Bismarck anchored in Norway's Grimstad Fjord as she began Operation Rheinübung. The sighting set off the chase that ended with Bismarck sunk on May 27, 1941. September 8, 1900, the Galveston hurricane destroyed St. Mary's Orphan Asylum, killing 10 Sisters of Charity and about 90 children. Only 3 boys, William Murney, Frank Madera, and Albert Campbell, survived by clinging to a tree and drifting until rescue. Oskar Dirlewanger, commander of the SS Penal Dirlewanger Brigade, was captured by French forces in early June 1945 while hiding near Altshausen, Germany. He died in French custody around June 7, 1945, widely reported as the result of a fatal beating by Polish guards or prisoners serving with the French. March 27, 1977. In dense fog at Los Rodeos, a departing KLM 747 began takeoff and struck a Pan Am 747 still on the runway, destroying both aircraft. All 248 aboard KLM and 335 aboard Pan Am died. 61 people on the Pan Am jet survived, prompting worldwide changes to radio phraseology and runway procedures. March 1922, Johannesburg. During the Rand Rebellion, armed white miners and some communists confronted police and troops, with scenes like a lone agitator daring cavalry to shoot. The government crushed the uprising under martial law using artillery and aircraft, leaving roughly 150 dead and thousands detained. Pulau Senang was Singapore's prison without bars, 1960-1963, where detainees labored freely to build a model settlement. On July 12, 1963, a riot killed Superintendent D.S. Dutton and 3 staff. 59 men faced a 64-day murder trial, with 18 ultimately hanged in 1965. Hotel de Gink clubs, c. 1913-1915, were self-run shelters for unemployed men, offering cheap beds, meals, haircuts, and tailoring. Residents paid small dues and volunteered about 2 days a week to keep them operating. This photo shows a New York site in 1915. 12th of April 1999, a Wuppertal-Schwebebahn train struck a maintenance clamp left on the rail near Robert-Daumplatz, derailed, and fell about 10 meters into the Wupper. 5 people were killed and 47 injured, the system's worst and only fatal accident since opening in 1901. On the 28th December 1950, the launch Ranui was wrecked on the rocks at Mount Maunganui during a return from Mayor Island. Of 23 people aboard, only 1 survived, making it one of New Zealand's deadliest pleasure boat disasters. October 1944, CDR David McCampbell, the U.S. Navy's top ace, posed in his F-6F Hellcat on USS Essex after Leyte Gulf. He finished the war with 34 victories and set the U.S. single mission record by shooting down 9 aircraft on October 24th, having earlier become an ace in a day during the Marianas battles. December 9, 1944, B-17G. Julie May was cut in two during a formation collision with B-17G Silver Dollar over France while en route to bomb Stuttgart. Julie May broke up and crashed with heavy loss of life. Silver Dollar managed a damaged landing and was repaired after the mission. August 19, 1987. During KNBC's 4 p.m. newscast in Burbank, Gary Stolman forced consumer reporter David Horowitz to read a statement on camera. The station cut the feed, and no one was hurt. Police arrested Stolman moments later, and the gun turned out to be an unloaded toy BB pistol. Nellie Mae Madison became California's first woman on death row in 1934 for killing her husband in Burbank. The jury found premeditated murder. After evidence of prolonged abuse surfaced and public support grew, the governor commuted her sentence to life, and she was paroled in 1943. Anastasia hams it up for a candid photo at Tsarskoye Selo, while her older sister Olga lies sick in bed nearby, circa 1915. The Romanov girls were serving in wartime hospitals that year, and this snapshot captures Anastasia's mischievous reputation in contrast to the somber setting. Winter 1919. Teenage volunteers from Estonian student battalions rest after fighting Red Army units. These improvised youth units helped hold the front until the rebuilt National Army counterattacked and secured independence in early 1920. Anton Drexler founded the German Workers' Party in January 1919 and helped recruit Adolf Hitler. In 1920, it became the NSDAP. By mid-1921, Hitler had replaced him as leader, and Drexler faded from the movement, dying in 1942. June 1967, Quezon City, actress Maggie de la Riva personally identified her 4 abductors from elite families days after the crime. All 4 were convicted. 3 were executed in 1972, while the 4th died by suicide in prison. 1942, North China. Japanese troops burned villages under the 3 alls policy. Kill all, burn all, loot all. A scorched earth campaign launched after the 100 Regiments offensive. Estimates attribute millions of civilian deaths in occupied northern China to these operations. Ellis Island physicians flipped immigrants' eyelids with fingers or a button hook to spot trachoma, a feared contagious eye disease that could mean detention or deportation. Between 1891 and 1930, about 80,000 arrivals were barred for medical reasons, though under 1% of entrants were typically rejected at inspection. 9 Sep 1966, USS Hornet offloaded the recovered Apollo Command Module CM-011 from the AS-202 suborbital test at Long Beach Naval Station for post-flight inspection, a step in qualifying the capsule's heat shield for crewed missions. Relna Brewer McCrae and Abby Pudgy Stockton, Muscle Beach pioneers, popularized women's strength training in the 1940s, often pressing 100 lb Myloglobe dumbbells in public shows. Shanghai, 1932. A kidnapper who murdered his young victim after the ransom lagged stands before a summary court. After his appeal was denied, he was tied to a post and executed by garrote on the spot. December 1952. A stagnant, high-trapped coal smoke over London, creating toxic smog that killed thousands and led to the 1956 Clean Air Act. August 1940. A shark-mouthed Messerschmitt Bf-110 Zerstörer patrols over the English Channel during the Battle of Britain. The twin-engine escort fighter proved outclassed by RAF single-engine fighters in daylight, but later excelled as a night fighter and fighter-bomber. Late 1944, early 1945, Warsaw lay in ruins after the failed uprising, with German forces systematically demolishing what fighting hadn't already destroyed. By January 1945, about 85–90% of the city's buildings were gone.